Hello, everyone. I'm Jean Haft, the Vice President of Academic Affairs and Dean at St. Paul. We are so glad to have all of you with us this evening, both on Zoom and live stream, watching the live stream. Welcome to our 2021 Slater-Willson Lectureship on Spiritual and Intellectual Life. The Slater-Willson Lectureship was established in 1967 by Mr. and Mrs. J.M. Wilson of Florida, Texas, and formerly the bishop of the Kansas area of the United Methodist Church. The lectureship brings creative minds to the campus to stimulate spiritual and intellectual life. And I can tell you that this evening we have a very creative mind, and I have no doubt that you will be stimulated spiritually and intellectually. The St. Paul faculty designated this academic year with a theme of immigration and migration. And we've offered several courses focusing on that theme. For instance, in our upcoming Focus Week courses, students may join our spiritual formation retreat, which will focus on Native American spiritual practices of resilience and resistance in the face of trauma of the forced migration. And that retreat will be led by Reverend Siobhan Colonel, Director of the United Methodist Native American Comprehensive Plan. Students could also during Focus Week take a practicum with Deaconess Cindy Andrade Johnson, who will lead a practicum in ministry and migrant context at the US-Mexico border based on her decades of work in ministry at the border. And then in April, the Evangelical Society has invited Dr. Sammy G. Alfaro to give a lecture entitled Pastoral Strategies for Ministering Among Latinx Immigrant Communities. But tonight we have the pleasure of welcoming Reverend Dr. Miguel de la Torre. Dr. de la Torre received his PhD from Temple University, and he currently serves at my alma mater as Professor of Social Ethics and Latinx Studies at Iliff School of Theology in Denver, Colorado. He is an internationally recognized speaker and teacher and activist, a prolific author, and I couldn't even begin to take the time to read the long list of publications. But I would like to highlight some of his texts, particularly the book Trails of Hope and Terror, Testimonies on Immigration, which I believe some of our classes are using as a textbook right now. The Immigration Crises Toward an Ethics of Place, and an upcoming book entitled Decolonizing Christianity, Becoming Badass Believers. So I strongly suggest that you visit his website, drmigueldelatorre.com, and see the many, many, many ways that Dr. de la Torre has contributed to expanding theological and ethical thought, and has contributed to God's work of transformation in the world. The title of his lecture tonight is Why Do They Come? He will speak to us for a little under an hour, probably around 45 minutes, and then we will take questions. We'll receive those questions through the chat feature on Zoom, and I will explain that to you after he is done speaking. I would ask that you all keep your mics muted until the question time, and if your name is called upon then. So we are so excited to receive Dr. de la Torre, to join with all of you gathered in these various electronic ways, which we are very grateful to have. May God open our hearts and stretch our minds as we receive Dr. de la Torre's words this evening. Will you join me in welcoming him to the St. Paul community?
Gracias, gracias. Buenas noches. I am so honored to be virtually in Kansas City and look to one day being physically with you all. But for right now, we are thankful for these electronic miracles, which I'm trying to figure out. June 21st, 1960. That's when I received a letter from the US government. And it basically said that I was in violation of Section 242 of the Immigration and Nationalization Act. A fancy way of saying that I overstayed my tourist visa. From that moment, the government gave me 30 days to self-deport. If I did not, I would be removed forcefully from the United States. I and my family chose not to leave. And from that point forward, we were undocumented, what racist people like to call today illegal, because no human being can ever be illegal. We lived in the shadows for about a decade until we finally were able to become US citizens. So the question that I want to raise today is, why did I come? Why do they come? Why am I here? For some people, the answer is we come looking for freedom and liberty and following the American dream. For others, we come to suck up all of your social services and take advantage of your generosity. I assure you that neither one of those answers are correct. The reason we are here is because of bananas. So I want to talk about bananas because that's why we are here. You see, back in the 1860s and 70s, Americans never heard of bananas. They never tasted a banana. And the reason is because to get a banana to, let's say, Kansas City would be almost impossible. It would ripen and spoil before it ever got there. But around 1870s, with the invention of a faster steamboat and refrigeration, Americans began to taste bananas for the first time. In the Chicago World Fair, they would sell little slices of bananas for 10 cents in a little aluminum cup. And quite frankly, Americans went bananas over bananas. By 1899, you guys were eating 16 million bushels of bananas a year. What comes from that is the creation of a corporation to make sure that bananas continue to enter the United States at a profit. And the company ended up being called the United Fruit Company. Now, I want to spend time talking about just one country, Guatemala. And basically, I'm going to use Guatemala as an example for the rest of Latin America. In 1901, Manuel Estrada Cabrera was the president or the dictator of Guatemala. And what he did was he allowed the United Fruit Company free reign in growing bananas and shipping them to the United States. In return, the United Fruit Company built the railroads from the fincas and the haciendas to the ports, and then they built the ports so that their boats could come and take the bananas to the United States. And they had a very good relation. And every time that people began to rebel against this economic structure, the United States would send in the Marines in order to prop up the government that protected the interests of the United Fruit Company. Hence the term banana republics. These were governments that were basically in place to protect profits of the United Fruit Company. This is also when Teddy Roosevelt began giving us what he called gunboat diplomacy. That is, this idea that these products belong to the United States and anyone who threatened it threatened the security of the United States. So basically, all the countries of Latin America, of Central America and the Caribbean basin during the 1900s were invaded 21 times to install a banana republic. That does not include the 26 covert CIA operation to overthrow governments and install new governments. So in the 20th century, it's conducted 47 regime changes in Central America and the Caribbean. So before Bush II ever talked about regime change, we were doing it in Latin America, okay? Gunboat diplomacy, banana republics. So by 1950 in Guatemala, basically the 2.2% of the population, that is the very rich and the United Fruit Company, controls 70% of all the land. So Jacobo Arbenz was democratically elected in Guatemala on the promise of modest land reform. Not anything wild, but just land reform, so that the peasants, who were 90% indigenous, at this time only controlled 10% of the land, that they could get more land. Okay, and the way he planned to do it was he went to the United Fruit Company and said, whatever you said your land was worth, so that you could pay taxes on that, we will pay you that, and we will take the land and distribute it among the indigenous population. The problem is the United Fruit Company, as you could imagine, undervalued their land so they could pay less taxes. The United Fruit Company did not like this. So what they did was they contacted two of their former attorneys. Both of the attorneys were brothers. The last name was Dulles. One of them happens to be Eisenhower's Secretary of State, and the other one happens to be the head of the CIA. And together, they arranged the second time the United States will engage in overthrowing a democratically elected government. The first time was in Iran, and we know the consequences of how that turned out. But the second country they destabilized through CIA propaganda and a fake Contra insurgency was in Guatemala. The elected president, had to flee the country, and that led to a 30-year civil war in where hundreds of thousands of Guatemalans died, or to protect the interests of the United Fruit Company. So I'm going to leave Guatemala for a second, because what goes on in Guatemala really becomes the model for the rest of Central America and the Caribbean. And I'm going to talk about my country, Cuba, where I was born. In 1895, after 30 years of struggling for our independence, we are finally winning. The Spaniards are beginning to negotiate. The United States did not want an independent Cuba for a multitude of reasons. So what they did was they invaded Cuba to fight the Spaniards when no one invited them to invade us to fight the Spaniards. The Cuban War for Independence, which was 30 years in the making, ends after like 2 or 3 weeks with the United States entering it. Teddy Roosevelt goes up some hill in San Juan and wins that, and literally wins the war in Santiago. And what happens is that the Cuban War for Independence becomes the Spanish-American War, where Cuba is not even mentioned. because it now becomes a war between two empires, the declining Spaniard Empire and the rising US Empire, okay? On the day of independence, on the day that the war was won, there was what is called the ceremony of the flag. That's where the flag of the colonizer comes down, the Spanish flag, and the flag of the new republic, of the new independent country, is raised. On that day in Santiago de Cuba, the US military prohibited any Cuban who fought independence to enter the city. So when the Spaniards left and took down their flags, the stars and stripes instead went up. And Cuba became a vassal of the United States. 10 years later, 1905, 60% of all the rural land was owned by American companies. For the military to leave, Cuban had to add to their constitution what was called the Platt Amendment. And the Platt Amendment basically said that the US could intervene in Cubans' internal affairs whenever Cubans were unable to govern themselves. It also meant that the United States could take any land on the island for military purposes, hence Guantanamo Bay. By 1905, 90% of all of our sugar and all of our tobacco, our two main crops, are US bound. 50% of all of our oil is US owned, and the rest is owned by the British and the Dutch. Cuba was invaded 4 times for the purpose of changing our government, and at least 2 covert CIA operations that we know of. Before the Castro Revolution, and after that, there was a lot more CIA operations. So I'm talking about immigration, but I'm giving you a history lesson instead. I want to pause that history lesson, and I want to talk about Mexico for a moment. Mexico is a little different. We had this ideology early in the Republic, the US Republic, called Manifest Destiny. That is, God has blessed white Euro-Americans with this promised land. And it is their manifest destiny to occupy all of the Western Hemisphere. There was just a problem. You had Indians living on the land, so you had to genocide them. But as you were eliminating them, you had a second problem, and you had another country, Mexico, to the west. So the problem becomes, what do you do with Mexico? James Polk runs for president, the 9th president, if I'm not mistaken, on a campaign promise that if he is elected president, he will invade Mexico. And literally a few months after being elected and after being installed as the president, he sends troops over the Mexican border and invades Mexico, keeping his campaign promise. When he does that, the Mexicans, seeing American troops approaching them on their land, fire back. This gives Polk the excuse to go to Congress and ask for a declaration of war. When he does that, John Quincy Adams, who is now a representative, he used to be president, but now he's a representative, states during the debates, and I'm pretty much quoting by memory, "I fear today the banners of our republics will become the banners of tyranny for what we're about to do to Mexico." Ulysses S. Grant, who was a soldier in the Mexican-American War, when he's dying of throat cancer in the 1880s, in his memoirs, he writes, "Just as our God punishes individuals, so too does God punish nations. And the Civil War was God's punishment upon us for what we did to Mexico." So there was a recognition among political leaders that we were invading another country to take away their land. Fast forward to when we're getting ready to invade Iraq, and Colin Powell is speaking at the United Nations, and he makes this beautiful speech about Americans never invade another country to take away their land, but only ask for enough to bury its war heroes. And of course, the Mexican ambassador laughed. And he laughed because half of Mexico went to the United States, and not just any half. The half included the gold of California, the silver of Nevada, the oil of Texas, all the natural harbors along the California coast, the copper of New Mexico and Arizona, the riches, the mineral riches that helps fund the industrial revolution that makes this empire the most wealthiest in the world, occurs by invading another country and stealing their natural resources. Okay, so a lot of history here. Let's go now to a little bit more modern history. And I'm thinking of 1994. In 1994, we passed the North Atlantic Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA, as it is known. And I want to explore NAFTA through just one particular crop, corn. So I want to talk about corn. Corn is the miracle crop. I mean, it could grow on high altitude, low altitude. It could grow with little rain, a lot of rain. I mean, you're all close to Iowa, so you know that corn grows pretty much anywhere, and it's the food of the people. Every Latin American country has its own corn dish. And in indigenous spirituality from the southern part of the hemisphere, corn, along with beans and squash, are known as the Three Sisters. Corn it was first domesticated in what is now Central America. And from there, it spreads northward and southward. According to the World Bank, which has never really been the friend of the poor, even they say that the major cause of world poverty is the $1 billion a day that industrial nation spends subsidizing their crops. In the US, during the first 10 years of NAFTA, 1995 to 2004, the US spent $41.9 billion subsidizing corn. It became cheaper to buy corn in Mexico than to grow your own corn. So in the first decade of NAFTA, Mexican corn prices plunged by 70%, while all the other essentials skyrocketed by 247%. Even the price of tortillas, which is made from corn, went up by 483%. Not surprisingly, 1.7 million farmers lost their farms due to NAFTA. So you have to imagine, you have an agricultural economy in where if you own a farm, not only are you feeding yourself, you are literally feeding a family of 5, 6, 7, 8. Okay? So it's not just one farmer, it's a family. Now, corn was grown the way it was done back centuries ago on the land where corn was first domesticated. Now, corn was devastated because it was cheaper to buy it. Before, if I was a farmer, a third of the corn I would use for myself and my livestock, a third I would save for the future, and a third I would sell, and with that I would buy, send my kids to school, buy the necessities of life. All that is gone. unable to raise food for my family, my only choice is to go to the border and work at the factories, the maquiladoras. These are US-owned factories located south of the border, where basically you don't have to follow any of those pesky laws about the environment or about worker safety. Now, the $30 an hour job in a refrigeration company in Iowa for Maytag now was moved to a maquiladora south of the border, where they paid the individual to do the same amount of work, $5 a week. So this windfall of profit literally goes to those who run these corporations. So we should not be surprised that the price of the CEO, when compared to the average worker, goes from something like 42 times in the late 1970s to over 300 times by the time we get to the new millennium. When NAFTA was being ratified, I take a step back. When NAFTA was enacted, we had an immigration explosion because individuals could no longer be farmers. They weren't paid enough at these maquiladoras. And you have to imagine, you're working in a maquiladora. If you ever been to Nogales and you're at the southern side of the border and you look through those gates, through the wall, which is see-through because they're poles, the first thing you see is a McDonald's. And you realize that you're working for $5 a week, and the pimple-faced kid at the McDonald's is probably making $8 to $9 an hour. That is the pull for cheap labor that forces many of these people to actually cross the border. Now, if only we would have known that the passage of NAFTA was going to create an immigration crisis. We knew. A year before NAFTA was ratified, in 1993, the GAO, the Government Accounting Office, this is a nonpartisan agency that studies the impact of every bill Congress is considering. They said in their evaluation of NAFTA that if NAFTA is ratified, there will be an explosion of immigration. NAFTA is ratified, and 3 months later, the Clinton administration puts in place Operation Gatekeeper. Operation Gatekeeper becomes the militarization of the border. You have to realize that before NAFTA, before Operation Gatekeeper, the way it used to work is I had my little farm in Mexico, and then during the off season for me, I would go to Tijuana and I would look at the newspaper and it would say something like, we need people to pick apples in Washington State. There's a bus at the Catholic Church in San Diego. So I would just cross over the border in Tijuana to San Diego, get on the bus, go up to Washington State, pick apples, and then I would work my way south with each harvest, ending up again in Mexico, working my own farm. So not only did I have my farm and made money there, but I also made money as a basero, as working the circuit. So the purpose of the Border Patrol wasn't to keep people out, it was to make sure people went back after they did the farming, after they actually did the harvesting. When NAFTA is ratified and Operation Gatekeeper takes place, the policy was to militarize the border so that people could no longer cross in Tijuana, in Nogales, in El Paso. The only place they could cross was to go deep into the mountains or the desert and cross there. Now, the Border Patrol, who developed this policy, which is known as the deterrence policy, they said in a memo that while they recognize people will die, it will still deter other people from taking the same journey. The truth of the matter is, nobody was deterred, and people continued to die crossing the desert. Some of some numbers, and I say underestimated because we just don't know how many people die in the desert, is that every 4 days, 5 brown bodies perish. And I say, and I say that we don't know because when I've walked the desert, I never forget this. I was walking the desert once, and I came across the carcass of some kind of a coyote. And about 3 days later, I went by the same trail, and there was practically nothing left of the coyote because animals of, scavenger animals and the desert itself swallows up the bodies where there's practically nothing left. And we only know of the bodies on the north part of the border. We have have any idea how many people are dying before they even get to the US border, that we never hear about and that we never know. And the other thing is, they only count the bodies that the Border Patrol and the federal agencies themselves find. So in one time, we found a body of a 14-year-old girl. Her name was Jocelyn, and her body doesn't count in the official numbers because it wasn't the government that found it, but we're the ones that found her instead. So here's the answer to the question, why do they come? So if you were kind of snoozing or you weren't paying attention, you want to pay attention now, because this is the punchline. When one nation builds roads into another nation to steal their raw material and their cheap labor, why should we be surprised that those people take those same roads following everything that has been stolen from them? The reason that I am in this country is not because I want to be. I would rather have stayed in my own country and my own culture. I am here following the sugar, the tobacco, and the rum that has been stolen from my country, the 3 necessities of life: sugar, tobacco, and rum. I am following all that has been stolen from us. This is crucial. We are here because of this neoliberal economic structure that has developed a foreign policy based on gunboat diplomacy and banana republics. So, how do we deal with this immigration crisis then? I hear the church all too often say things like, we need to show hospitality to the immigrant among us. It is our Christian responsibility to show the virtue of hospitality. That is the worst thing you could ever say or do. And here's why. When you say that you want to show hospitality to the undocumented, you are assuming you own the house. And out of the goodness of your heart, you're going to allow me to visit and stay in your house. What I am arguing is that this house was built through our cheap labor and our stolen raw materials. So I don't want your hospitality. I want my damn house back. I want to be repaid for what was stolen from us. So the question is not hospitality being the Christian response to this immigration crisis. The proper ethical response is restitution. What do we owe Central America and the Caribbean for everything we stole from them so we build this mighty empire that we all live in right now? And on that happy note, I'll bring my talk to a close and will be more than happy to get into some questions.
Thank you, Dr. De La Torre. You ended, you left us there on this very important note, and I was like, okay, but then you stopped. So I'm sure there are lots of questions. I would ask you all to put your questions in, indicate that you have a question in the chat, and I will follow those questions and call on your name and ask you to unmute and then I will ask you to voice your questions. So I'm watching, and I'm sure it'll take a little while for people to get their questions typed in, Dr. De La Torre. And if I was really smart, I would have had a question prepared to transition this time. But I'm still struck there on the not a theology of hospitality, but a theology of reparation, restitution. So I would ask Linda Westerhold has a question. Linda's a student at St. Paul. Linda, would you unmute yourself?
Okay, there I am. Yeah, you left me with a wow, great question. And I immediately went to, because I asked the same thing, because I thought of the, when we took the land from the Native Americans, and then all of a sudden we gave it back to them when we gave the reservations. And same with when I read your book, and my instructor will, Dr. Howell will tell you, I wrote pages of, I can't believe this is happening, because it was an eye-opener for me. And so I thought, okay, so we gave that. So what is the restitution then? Because we took the land from Mexico, we took Arizona, we took Nevada, we took all that. And so your question was exactly what I had asked was, so then how do we do the restitution for what we took? Because we did restitution for the Native Americans. And I actually asked my husband the same question. But then I got to thinking about, but now we have kind of coupled this with the problem of, the dreamers. And so we do have people, and I don't know how many, the numbers are high, that, they've been here their whole life. They're now, or they should be American citizens, my opinion only, because they were basically raised here from the age of 2 through 18 or 20, right? Even though they weren't born here. And so now you're telling them they live here too. They're now, is what I would say, should be American citizens. So now you're going to say pay restitution as well. So how does that complexity work into all this?
And you're right, it is complexity. I don't have the answers, even though I'm going to give one in a few minutes. And I say I don't have the answers because I don't make policy. I'm an ethicist. I just say this is unjust what we're doing. And then we have to figure out how to begin to move towards justice. I purposely use the word restitution because it's one of those words that rubs people the wrong way, okay? Obviously, we can't give back all the land to Mexico that was stolen. which the Mexicans stole from the Indians to begin with. So that's in itself is problematic. And I would say that most of my indigenous friends would say that we never paid them restitution. In fact, if we were to honor all the treaties that we've done with indigenous people, we would have to literally give back half of the United States, which we're not about to do. So I don't want to just say restitution and leave it there. I mean, I did it in the talk because I wanted to get into it a little bit more now in the conversation. But what would that look like? And here's my thinking. The individuals who are economically oppressed in this way, more than any other group, happens to be those on whose sweat and back this empire was built, whether it be the stolen land of the indigenous people, the forced labor of the African people, the resources from Latin American people. It is literally our sweat and our muscle that build this empire. And yet our tax policies are to continue to funnel the vast majority of the wealth to the wealthiest 1% who are predominantly of the dominant culture. So what I've envisioned as, and I'm not the only one. I mean, this is a conversation to have. We don't want a check. We don't want money. We don't want land. What we want is the same opportunities that are provided for the dominant culture. I know when I was going through college experience, I could barely get a scholarship because I was a Latino. I would love to see the monies that go into rich schools from kindergarten to 12th grade, also the same amount of money go into the schools and the ghettos and the barrios. But we don't do that. So restitution becomes, in my mind, how do we begin to provide the opportunity and the means by which to lift up a people who have historically been disenfranchised, disinherited, and dispossessed. Now, you have some universities who are beginning to do things like this. Like Georgetown is saying, we sold these slaves in order to be able to pay off this mortgage. So now we're going to go and get the descendants and provide them with scholarships. Now, that doesn't solve the problem. It doesn't, wash away the sin that was committed to those individuals, but it begins to move forward to bringing healing to the consequences of their systematic abuse and systematic racism. So when I say restitution, I know that word, I'm leaving it out there because I have no idea what that would look like. But I do think that there is conversation on how to make this a possibility, and some institutions have already begun to move in that direction. At the very least, new trade agreements with Latin America, where the United States does not take all our resources and gives us whatever they decide to give us in prices. Respect our sovereignty. Literally, I mean, just a few years ago, we were trying to overthrow the Venezuelan government. Now, don't get me wrong. I think that I'm not in favor of the Venezuelan government. I think that they're really abusing their people, but it's up to them to decide for themselves how to deal with their crisis, not us. I mean, obviously I have problems with the Cuban government, but it's for the Cuban people to determine what the government's going to be. Instead, we have an embargo that is literally causing misery and death on that island. And I go to Cuba a couple of times a year. So how do we move away from a policy of hegemony in this Western hemisphere, in where we dictate the policies, the government, governmental policies for other nations. We all know about 9/11, and we remember it as a horrible day. But if you're in Argentina, 9/11 is when the United States overthrew the Allende government and installed the Pinochet dictatorship, where tens of thousands of people disappeared and were killed. They had their own 9/11 that we caused. How do we stop doing this? So that's the first step. And the second step, for those of us who are here, who have lived the consequences of this abuse, I mean, definitely, how do we begin to think of providing community that have been denied for generations? Those are just some of my thoughts on that right off the top of my head.
I'm sure we'll talk more about what you mean by restitution and what that might look like. I'm thinking we might go to Paul Klipp's question about, I knew when you started talking about growing corn in Iowa that we would have questions about the cultural base of our region. Paul, if you would unmute yourself and ask your question.
Yeah, so I incredibly appreciate your presentation. As someone who grew up in a rural community and currently pastors a rural church, definitely not a perspective that I get to hear or have heard in my context. And so when you started talking about the corn subsidies, it piqued my interest both in your book and in your presentation. I know of families that have depended on that subsidy to help keep food on their tables. And so I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on balancing the needs of those families that need those funds on this side of the border, as well as balancing the needs of the families and the farms on the other side of the border as well.
Yeah. No, and I wish I was an economist who knew the agricultural formulas well enough to be able to answer that question. But let me just say this. Definitely, the major cause of poverty in the third world is subsidizing crops in developing countries. I mean, that's just a given. And you're absolutely right that subsidy, because I mean, when I was a pastor in rural Kentucky, the subsidies on tobacco is what kept those farmers, above water, and they still had to work another job just to make ends meet. So I don't want to dismiss the problem of the rural area. And I always find it fascinating that we're one of the few nations that really not only demonizes the people who grow our food, but really doesn't take care of them. So I find that fascinating. That's probably a good conversation for another time. Here's why this problem is not going to go away. In order to create a fairer economic balance, okay, how do we help the farmers, but at the same time not providing a disadvantage in foreign trade? This is a topic we will never discuss. And we will never discuss it because where do we hold our first presidential caucus? In Iowa. And imagine a president, somebody running for president saying, we need to rethink subsidies and we need to rethink how we handle our corn crops. They'll never, ever make it out of the gate. So this is one of those topics that we will never, ever discuss. Now, not to just blame the United States here. Let's also understand what's going on in Mexico. Originally, when NAFTA was signed, the tariffs on corn was in place to try to create a certain balance. And again, I'm not an economist, but the way I understand it is that the tariffs would at least protect the farmers to some extent. However, the Mexicans, when they signed NAFTA, had two things going against them. Number one, the government wanted to move away from our culture and become a manufacturing economy. So they provided very little subsidies or very little protection for their farmers in Mexico. And that created that tremendous imbalance. So there's no subsidies at all for corn if you're a Mexican corn grower. The second one, and this is really more diabolical, one of the negotiators for NAFTA on the Mexican side owned the largest poultry industry in Mexico. So he moved the eliminations of tariffs 5 years, I think it was 5 or 10 years before they were supposed to be lifted, so that he could buy cheaper corn from the United States and therefore increase his wealth in his poultry farm to the detriment of. So I want to be clear. I mean, I talk about the US complicity in this, but I also need to be aware that there is a Mexican complicity in this. But then I could turn around and say that the reason why you have this Mexican complicity is because that 1% who controls the Mexican economy are the same people who are working together with the 1% here to the disadvantage of its own people. So I guess, and again, I'm not giving an answer how to solve this, but we need to start moving towards the direction of how do we change our cultural policies so that we could help our local farmers, but at the same time, not devastate the farmers in other places. And part of it may be tariffs.
Thank you. I think that gives a lot of those who are in these agricultural rural communities some things to think about. We have another question from Nash Carey, who is also a student at St. Paul. Nash, you want to ask your question?
Yeah, thank you. What reform can occur when we are dealing with an imperial capitalistic impression? Like as Americans, we live in a political binary, one who's trying to close the country to anyone in need, and another that seems like fine with just the idea of undocumented labor to fill jobs that Americans won't take. Either side, it seems like an exploitation of their immigration status to create slave-like labor. Who are the good guys that we can get behind in America?
I'm thinking as to who the good guys are because I don't know him offhand. And this is unfortunately the plight of the oppressed, of the poor, of the campesinos, of the workers of the land. They're the ones that are always being taken advantage of by both sides, in their own government and here as well. And you're absolutely right. We need to close the border. We need to build the wall. But Tyson wants to make sure that it sends buses to the border to bring migrants over here so they could work in their factories. While they're also providing funds to the same politicians who are arguing about closing the border, because it has nothing to do with ideology. It has to do with creating that fear-mongering to get the necessary votes. So no, I mean, I don't know what the answer is, how to fix it, but I would like to say at least what we can start doing, and I said this earlier this morning, we could at least stop being so sadistic in our policies. I mean, yes, we need to have, some kind of, process by which to enter the country, but we shouldn't be tearing children from their parents. I mean, we shouldn't be putting small children into cages as though they were animals. So maybe if we could just start doing that, I'll be happy, not to ignore all the other, oppressive structures that you just touched on. But at least let's begin with being humane, which we just simply are not. What we're doing to brown people on the border, it's just criminal. It's just criminal, and we keep doing it.
So,
You know, and
I'm sorry, is there
no, go
an
ahead.
organization maybe that you can point us towards, or a group of people, a conglomerate, something that we can like maybe get behind, because it is hard to find our avocations, and it's,
Yes.
I think maybe you could help us.
Absolutely. There's many organizations that I work with. Borderlinks is one of them. They're educational, basically, in Tucson. No More Deaths, they're the radicals. They're the radical ones. I love them dearly. They're the ones I mostly work with. There's Fronteras. I mean, now here's the thing you need to realize. There were literally hundreds, if not thousands, of small immigrants around the country. And you're probably wondering, well, why don't they all just get together and have one major organization that does this? And that's what they did in the 1980s, when people like John Fife began the sanctuary movement. And what happened was the government was able to quickly determine who the leaders were, went after them, arrested them, they were convicted as felons, and it tried to destroy the organization that way. But because it's so decentralized, it's kind of hard to know who the leaders are, so it makes it harder for the government to persecute them. But if you want to know, if you want to definitely be in touch and be in conversation with some of these groups, those are three I just mentioned right there. I would begin with Borderlinks, because they're the educational group. And I would say, come to the border, walk the trails, leave some water and food for the migrants. That would radicalize you and revolutionize you. No question about it. And then later through these, loose networks is how we get our news, and we know what to push for and what policies to advocate for.
Excellent. Thank you so much.
I want to double check back in with Kayla Hauk. Kayla, I skipped over your question earlier because I thought that Dr. De La Torre had answered it, but I'm wondering if you have any follow-ups.
Sure. So my question was, it's really unlikely the US is going to just start giving out money to countries, right? So what can we do to help shape conversations that will make sure that the US isn't causing more harm than we already have?
Yeah, well, you're absolutely right. In order for the United States to continue to funnel the vast majority of the world's resources so that we all could live with the riches that we live with, requires policies and a powerful military to protect that privilege. And that's not going to change. It doesn't matter if it's a conservative or a liberal. A liberal president will just as quickly defend Mobil and Microsoft and McDonald's as a conservative president do. They will still protect the empire. And that's just a given. What I'm calling for, and this is why I talk about being hopeless in my book, Embracing Hopelessness, because this is beyond our ability to really change. But what we can try to do is to humanize some of these institutions. Why is the United States the major producers of weapons in the world? And it's not that we provide weapons to country for geopolitical reasons. We just sell it to the highest bidder. There's no foreign policy logic to it. Why do we continue to dictate to other governments what their policy should be and not respect their sovereignties? So how do we become involved in those issues? Now, you're probably thinking, but there's so many issues. How can I get involved in so many things? And you cannot. No one can. So my policy as an ethicist has always been, I'm involved in two issues. One that touches my skin, in this case, immigration. And then the second issue is one in where I am not personally engaged in, one that doesn't touch my skin at all. And the reason being, in those issues in where I don't have a dog in the fight, I am standing in solidarity with others who are being oppressed. Not to lead, not to tell them what to do, but just to stand in solidarity and work with them for their cause of justice. In the same way, they are working with me on issues of immigration. And this is where it becomes important. When I talk about immigration, like I did tonight, I'll bet you someone is probably thinking, why is he such an angry Latino? Or they might be thinking, well, of course he's going to say that. He's an immigrant. I mean, what do you expect him to say? Okay, so I am automatically dismissed. Everything I said can very easily be dismissed. But when a white person whose ancestors been a bunch of generations and have nobody who's an immigrant in their immediate family start talking about the injustice of immigration, they're going to listen to you before they listen to me. Now, of course, I feel horrible because I could talk about immigration. I mean, I don't need somebody to talk for me about immigration. But the reality is they'll listen to you before they listen to me. So then the question becomes, how can you be a faithful ally? And the way you do it is not to talk for me, but instead to share how you are privileged by having immigrants in this country and how you are complicit with their abuse, which is what I do when I'm involved in other causes of which I am the one privileged because I'm not the one being oppressed by those particular structures.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
There were some questions about the role of corporations and big business. So I'm going to come back to our student, Jake Jacobson.
Hey, doctor, it's really nice to meet you. Actually, I kind of was piggyback on Kayla's comments that she just asked, but, I wanted to know if it was a one-fold problem like governmental, or whether it was a two-fold problem, governmental and corporation problems. And I personally see it as a two-fold problem, and you kind of talked about that already. And then also, I have a kind of a diverse background in the military. So I have some thoughts on foreign policy issues and who we sell stuff to and why we do it. And if we don't do it, why people buy stuff from other countries as well. But those are just some of my thoughts that I was going to ask you about. And I appreciate your comments.
Oh, absolutely. And I think it's more than just a twofold problem, it's multi. I mean, definitely we have problems with the government and its policies, and where the only way you could get elected, not the only way, but one of the ways that you could get elected is by scaring people to vote for you. And hence the immigrant becomes the danger, and that gets people to vote. Corporations also are complicit because what they care about is profit. They don't care about anything else. And if they could get the slave laborers working at those meat and poultry farms, preparing our food, they will do that. And if they get COVID working shoulder to shoulder, who cares? There's others behind them. So definitely you have the corporate responsibility. But I don't want to let other institutions off the hook. The education institution, who maintains this romanticized U.S. history. I mean, when I do this, when I did the lecture tonight, I talked a lot about U.S. history, and I'm curious how many people knew this about their history. And I would say a lot of people just don't know their own history. And that is our own educational institution that creates a mythology that makes us think we're somehow exceptional, and therefore we don't have to follow basic ethical rules. And then you have just hatred, which goes around different groups of people, in where people hate me because I'm an immigrant. You know, and it's not just hate that they don't like me, you know, because growing up, I've been called spick and been spit on a few times. So I mean, I've seen that face of hatred. But now people want to literally kill me. I can't tell you how many death threats I've gotten because of my views on immigration. So it's not just the government and corporations. There's a lot of blame and complicity to go around. So the struggle that we're having is, how do we raise a consciousness that we can begin to see that the path we're going in, if we continue on this path, to a lot of deaths, if not deaths caused somewhat unintentionally, like people crossing the border, but even more designed death, as in, getting rid of those types of people one way or another. These are scary times we're living in.
Dr. De La Torre, we had I'm sorry, Jake, you wanted to?
I just wanted to say thank you, sir. I appreciate your answer.
There's a question that I think might follow well on what you were just talking about, Dr. De La Torre, and it's from Paul. And it's a question about the role of social media. So Paul, if you can unmute, if you would like to unmute and ask your question.
Yeah, certainly, Dr. De La Torre, thank you for coming this evening. My question is that we are bombarded on a daily basis by social media and the propaganda machines of all the parties who are in power. And it seems that because they have the power, if you like, they have forced us as American people to take sides. And sometimes we have lost the true meaning of what it is to be an undocumented person coming into the country. So we are forced to, whether we are Republican or Democrat. I'm English by birth, so I take a sort of outside viewpoint sometimes. How can we control the media so we get a fair and balanced perception of what it is to be undocumented? And my second part of that is, how can we as Christian denominations as well, whether it's Islam or Judaism, how can we as Christians stand up and fight for the undocumented? We seem to have lost our voice as Christians. We talk about the love of God for all people, and yet we as Christians in many cases have lost that true meaning of Christ's love for all people. Thank you.
Yeah, those are good questions. Let me begin with the first one, and now about the social media. I think the genie's out of the bottle. I can't imagine any way that our social media could ever be controlled. I think we are in an age of disinformation. We are in an age of where Q is just as valid as an encyclopedia. And I mean, we are entering a new dark ages, I believe, because of the things that you just mentioned with social media. The only thing that I know, and I might be old school, is really developing relationships with the undocumented. When we get to know a person, not as a caricature, but as an individual, that movable middle can be moved. Back in the early 2000s, I was very active with the Human Rights Campaign, which was fighting for marriage equality at the time. This was before any state. And one of their strategies was for people to come out of the closet for no other reason, so that they could develop relationship with other people. Mm-hmm. So that they're no longer this gay person who is the stereotype of what a gay person is, but instead it's my cousin, it's my uncle, it's my neighbor, it's my butcher, it's the person next door. And as more people develop relationships, a lot of those stereotypes, I mean, they didn't go away, they're still there, but you began to get marriage equality passed. You began to get move beyond the no tell, whether the no, don't say, don't tell, or whatever the policy was in the military at the time. We began to now, I mean, now we're talking about trans rights. again, we're nowhere close to being there for our queer brothers and sisters and siblings, but at least the strategy of humanizing the other, what I think was very powerful. So how do we do this? And I think and going to your second question, I think that's what churches and ministries are so important, because the whole purpose of ministry is to be in community, to be in with people. But we continue to be so segregated that we don't become the bridges between these different groups that have been polarized. And again, if I remember my my Latin correctly, priest does mean bridge. So not that we're into these areas, same location, we just build up our own walls so we don't communicate with each other. So how do we then be in solidarity? And again, this goes back to being a liberation theologian myself. Number one rule is solidarity, is to be with the oppressed. In the book An Ethics of Place, what I'm arguing is you really got to be with the undocumented community physically, not just intellectually, not just reading it in a book, but actually physically being in contact face to face, obviously after COVID, in relationship with. That's what an ethics of place is all about, that I'm trying to argue for. So yeah, those are just some ideas based on your question.
Thank you. Speaking of COVID, Kat Friedel, another St. Paul student, has a question about COVID.
Yeah. Hey, thanks for joining us. Can you hear me okay?
Perfectly.
Okay. I would love if you could spend a couple of minutes talking about the effect of COVID on those that are documented and undocumented that are immigrants, and perhaps you could expand that to healthcare and this issue, this topic.
Mm-hmm. Well, as we know, those who have been mostly devastated by COVID-19 have been African Americans and Latinx people. Even though there was a senator in Ohio, state senator, who was saying it's because we don't know how to wash our hands. The real reason is because as essential workers, and because of poverty, living in multi-generational housing, makes us at high risk for getting COVID. As the vaccine is being rolled out, the early numbers of those who received the vaccine have been predominantly white Americans, not people of color, who are the ones being mostly devastated. And as we are seeing, when we do have the vaccine being offered in communities of color, many white people show up at those centers to get the vaccine. So the racism in our health system is alive and well during this COVID time. Now, that's speaking here within the States. I have not been in the border since COVID, since the pandemic began. But I've been speaking to my friends on the border, and what they're telling me is that by creating these migrant camps south of the border, it has become a petri dish for COVID to just spread among the people. And early on, we were sending people who had COVID back to their countries of origin with the COVID, So how we've dealt with the undocumented during COVID is shameful, to say the least. But also how we're dealing with people of color, especially Latinx, who are the descendants of immigrants, it's just as shameful. When all this is over, I'm sure there'll be many books written about how COVID was, becomes a way by which it thinned the herd, the herds of color.
We have a question related to dreamers from Amos McCarthy. And then I think we'll take Carissa's question and text samples, and then that will probably be the conclusion for us. But Amos?
Yes, that just talk about, being a theologian of liberation. And we all were agreed that liberation is actually freedom, from oppression as it relates to, things that happen in society. These dreamers here were brought, they were on their own accord, they were children. They did not have the mental capability to reason. And we found them in this predicament. Most of them have grown up. They have families that they have to feed, and rendering them undocumented sometimes bring great suffering on these people. My question here is, what is the pathway that can be taken to make sure this problem is solved? Everybody point to Congress. What are some of the things we can say to Congress that will awaken their moral consciousness or the moral conscience to be able to pass a common sense legislation to liberate all of these adults who were brought in this country as children, who had no decision of their own in the process?
I think the problem I have with your question is I think you're assuming Congress has a moral conscience. I'm not quite sure that our Congress cares about morality at all. I'm even more cynical, but I think they're more interested in getting reelected. And the problem is, in most of the districts around the country, I can get reelected by making you afraid of these dreamers. That's what would get me elected. So I don't see Congress as solving this problem. I know that the Biden administration wants a pathway to citizenship for 11 million undocumented individuals. That's exciting. I don't think it's going to happen. At the end of the day, it's going to be filibustered and it will not pass. Because the hatred towards the undocumented is greater than any moral conscience of doing the right thing. And even the DACA students, and I think I mentioned this earlier today, when we think that by executive order, we provided them a lifeline, and we say, isn't that great? We have to remember that they received that lifeline on an election year in June before the November election, because the Latinos were basically saying, we're not going to vote for Obama again because he has ignored us. And that's why the DACA was signed as an executive order. It wasn't, again, because of any moral reasoning. It was more to get the necessary votes. So I guess to answer your question, it's not relying on Congress, it's really relying on us to mobilize people to vote for individuals in where they would realize that by going with immigration reform, they're going to get more votes than by ignoring it. I'm not sure we're there. I don't think we are. But what choice do we have but to continue to fight for these reforms and for this right? And I guess what I'm saying is, there is no argument I'm ever going to give that's going to convince a person who hates me not to hate me. A person who thinks I don't deserve to be here to think that I belong. It's just not going to happen.
Thank you. Carissa Miller, another one of our students, has a question about the relationship of hospitality and restitution. Carissa?
Hi, nice to meet you. Thank you so much for being here and for speaking to us today. My question is basically, can't hospitality be a part of restitution if we recognize that the homes and the spaces we have in the society we have is unfortunately built on the backs of people who have been exploited from Central Latin America? Can't hospitality be a good starting place? At least I feel like a lot of our churches aren't even there. So yeah, I would appreciate it.
I hear what you're saying, and obviously I'm speaking to a different audience, and where my job as an ethicist is to make sure we know what the conversation. And I hear the strategy of at least let's talk about hospitality because it might get more people on board. But I guess my concern is that if we talk only about hospitality, we create a false narrative in that we're the ones that are the good guys. And because we're so good and so Christian, we're going to share with you because it's what Jesus would do. And that creates this narrative that really masks the horror that my land was stolen, that my resources were stolen, that my labor was stolen, and that I'm owed something for that. And I know we don't want to talk about that because then it might make people feel guilty that they're not the good Christians that they thought they were offering hospitality. So I guess maybe, and I'm thinking this out as I'm talking to you, I guess maybe the Southern Baptist evangelical in me that wants to say you're a sinner is just coming out and saying, you know, hospitality allows one to mask their sin and their complicity with oppression. And I guess I just, you know, don't want to do that anymore. You know, I want to deal with, no, you don't own the house to begin with. You know, I built that house. My labor built that house. My sugar, my tobacco, my rum built that house. But again, if you're a pastor in a small church, this may not preach on Sunday. So you have to use your own judgment. But I would hope that if you do begin with hospitality, somewhere along the line, you begin to introduce complicity with oppression and not gloss over that.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you. Text sample. You tried to get in a long time ago.
Well, I wanted other people to have a shot first. Two quick things. One is that this is in part a Gamaliel piece that we're doing here, and the Metropolitan group of Gamaliel here, called Moore Square in short, it has an immigrant rights task force, and I would urge people to get involved with that. We're also working through Stand Up KC to raise the minimum wage to $15 in a union for especially fast food places. And that involves, as you know, a good many immigrants in our town. But let me try another comment, and I'd like for you to comment on it, if you would, Doctor. One thing I love about your comments this morning in your lecture is the realism, and you've not given us any kind of happy solution because there ain't one. Let me ask you in terms of this kind of a comment. Part of our problem is we've got a plutocracy where the rich rule. We've got a technocracy and a tyranny of meritocracy and a way in which that rules us, and several others, not to mention racism, of course, and sexism and classism. What if we did this? What if we worked for the elimination of the Electoral College? We've got a country that's going to increasingly be a country where every racial ethnic group is in the minority. So what if we eliminate the electoral college? What if we make it necessary that senators each represent the same number of people? So Delaware doesn't have 2 senators, and California has 2, where we have huge numbers of Latinx people. What if we went to public ownership of major corporations, so that any corporation with over $100 million of investment would be not state-owned, but publicly owned? And that would mean its board would be elected by the citizens. And the task there would not to be to make profit, though some profit is necessary, but indeed to raise the wages of people in that industry at least to a living wage or above that. What if we really thought about production for use primarily and not for profit? And what if we reorganize the society in that direction? That's a heck of a project and probably not likely soon. I'm helped some by the people who think that capitalism is now dying. But how would you comment on some such suggestions as those? I know that you will continue your realism, and I welcome it.
Well, I mean, it's interesting, as I hear you speak, a lot of the things that you mention, as you well know, is the consequences of slavocracy. The electoral college, the way we do our capitalism, all this has its roots in the hatred towards Black bodies and their enslavement. These are the consequences of that original sin of this country. And we're still holding on to, just pick on the electoral college, we hold on to that as though this is some kind of God-given truth from Mount Sinai or something, when in fact it was a way to protect slave owners and making sure that they still had power in Congress. So I think what you're asking really is, how do we move away from a country that was founded on the principle of protecting the privilege, the profits, and the power of white male landowners towards a new way of government that definitely is more democratic in how it does its who owns the means of production, who owns the ability to elect people, and all that. So you're calling for revolution, and I'm down with revolution. I love them. Been through a few myself, so that's not a problem. However, going back to the realism of it, we're not going to get there. There's too much investment in protecting the power, privilege, and profit of the minority. And once we begin to truly push for these radical changes, all the power that this minority holds, from the police to the military, will be used to squash any of this. I mean, just look at what happened with what is it that with the stock market, and what's the name of that company? Computer spot.
GameStop.
Yeah. All of a sudden, all these Wall Street crooks are now saying, no, this is unfair. We need to have a more, you can't do that. We need to, protect us so we can continue robbing everybody else. I mean, it's, and they're going to get away with it,
Look at 2008. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. But here's my response with my realism. So you may want to ask, well, then why bother? If it's not going to change, it was still going to be developing new forms to maintain the structure of oppression. Why should we care? Why should we bother? And here's my answer to that. I fight for justice. I fight for what you just dreamed of, not because I think I'm going to win. I fight for justice because it defines not only my faith, but it defines my very humanity. It is the struggle for justice that defines who I am as a person. If I win, great. If I lose, it doesn't matter, because that wasn't my purpose in life, wasn't to be the savior of the world. And I think once I've made that decision, once I realize that this is why I fight for justice, I don't burn out on the immigration struggle. I don't get tired. I don't, say I'm going to give up. Why bother? It never depended on me. It just depends on me being faithful to what I say I believe in.
Thank you. I'm going to let President Blair make a final
Thank you.
comment, and then I think it's time for us to conclude.
Doctor, thank you so much for your time. I think of how this subject matter became closer to me out of circumstance in the last couple of years, and I won't. I'll try to keep this brief, but I always figured that action for me speaks louder than words. And in discovering a way that, with my background, and I can't share the names, but participate in the life of an undocumented couple who have become friends out of, I won't get into the detail. But it occurred to me when I heard one day that they have paid rent for 23 years and never missed a rent payment, that I took it upon myself, not because I'm a person of great means, but I have some, like many of us on this call, to work to make it possible for them to own their own home. And it maybe is a small way, maybe it's almost like a starfish story. I threw that one back in the ocean, so that made a difference. It's not like I think it's a great thing that I've done, but it is something that I've done. And this family, because of the relationship we have, will in the near future own a home. And I'd be paying for it, but I will make it possible because of the rum and the tobacco and the corn that I've been blessed with, or have stolen and didn't even know that my ancestors did. But your story helps me understand the reparation can begin in very small ways with each one of us. I may not get to the border, I may get to the border, but I built a relationship with somebody who's not documented. And I'm going to see how far that can go with others. So I just, and it so pleases me, brings me joy. Maybe that's very selfish, but it has. I just want to share that with you.
Well, thank you for sharing that. And I think that, and I think this is what restitution begins to look like. Also not just letting the government and institutions do this work, but us as individuals. What can we do as individuals as well becomes important. It won't solve the problem, but it will move us closer towards something that's just.
Thank you so much. I know that we have lots going on in our minds and our hearts after hearing your words and thinking through all that you have provoked in this conversation. I want to especially thank our brilliant students for asking so many great questions and for all the studying and thinking they're doing every day. But let us show our appreciation to Dr. De La Torre for his wonderful presentation tonight. And thank you. And we hope someday COVID will not be restricting travel and that you'll make it over to our campus again. So thank you so much, Dr. De La Torre.
Thank you for having me tonight. Blessings to all of you.
Blessings to you.